All right, let's talk about our next thing. And this comes from listener Nick Brooks asking about the Philadelphia experiment. And I love this topic because it is so bonkers. The Philadelphia experiment, it's a conspiracy theory from the 1950s. It has to do with teleportation and cloaking devices. But this is also a good example of how conspiracy theories come into existence because they're based on second or third or fourth hand accounts and wishful thinking, and you mix them all together and you get stuff like this or theories that Adolf Hitler is alive. So let's look into how the sausage is made when it comes to conspiracy theories, and the Philadelphia experiment is a good example. Okay, so what is it? Well, the Philadelphia experiment, it's an alleged military experiment that is supposed to have been carried out by the U.S. Navy at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in Philadelphia sometime around October 28th, 1943. What happened is, the legend goes, is that the U.S. Navy destroyer escort, the USS Eldridge, was claimed to have been rendered invisible or cloaked to enemy devices. Maybe they stole it from the Romulans. More specifically, it was made invisible. It was teleported to New York. It was teleported to another dimension where it encountered aliens. And then it was teleported through time, and it resulted in the deaths of several sailors. And some of them were fused with the ship's hull. It sounds like the movie Event Horizon, if you've ever seen that. Really freaky sci-fi horror movie. It's, like I said, it's a perfect example of how conspiracy theories start, because all of this information is based on somebody who gets a note from someone who claims that they saw something happen. And it makes reference to theoretical physics or science at the time, but the ideas are half-baked. They sound plausible to someone who really doesn't know the science, but if you actually know what's being claimed, you see that it doesn't work. It's like New Age gurus talking about quantum physics and quantum entanglement, where they think if they just slap the word quantum on things, then that makes it scientific. And also, the people who support this theory claim that, well, the Philadelphia experiment is classified, so that conveniently makes it impossible for independent investigators to actually look into it themselves and see if what is being claimed it is true or false. So let me walk this through you to see how the Philadelphia experiment all plays out. The experiment was allegedly based on an aspect of some unified field theory. This is a term coined by Albert Einstein to describe a class of potential theories that would describe the intersection of gravity and different types of fundamental forces of the universe, electromagnetism. So this would converge these respective fields into a single field. And physicists have looked for unified theory. Whoever gets it, they're going to be on the short list for a Nobel Prize for sure. When physicists were investigating this in the 1950s, some thought that unified field theory, you could verify it by using large electrical generators to bend light around an object via refraction so that the object could become completely invisible. This is what some suspected. So there was speculative talk about invisibility in the 1950s. So the conspiracy with the Philadelphia experiment is that the Navy regarded this approach to invisibility of military value and sponsored an experiment. Another version of the Philadelphia experiment story proposes that researchers were preparing magnetic and gravitational measurements of the seafloor in order to detect anomalies, supposedly based on Einstein's attempts to understand gravity. In this version, there were also secret experiments in Nazi Germany to find anti-gravity, allegedly by Hans Kindler. The rumor was that the government was creating technology that would render naval ships invisible to enemy radar, and that in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, they were testing that out. Witnesses claimed that there was an eerie green-blue glow that surrounded the hull of the ship as the generators spun up, and then suddenly the Eldridge disappeared. The ship was then seen in Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Virginia before disappearing again and reappearing back at Philadelphia. Okay, so where did this theory come from? Where did this all come from? Well, it came from, in 1955, the astronomer and UFO researcher Morris K. Jessup, who is the author of the book The Case for the UFO, about unidentified flying objects and exotic means of propulsion. He received 2 letters from Carlos Miguel Allende, who also identified himself as Carl M. Allen in another correspondence. He claimed to have witnessed a secret World War II experiment at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. So this original story comes 10 years or 12 years after the purported event. by somebody who claimed to have seen this happen, writing a letter to another person who just wrote a book about UFOs, if you can track what's going along so far. Jessup, in his writings, apparently included text about unified field theory because this is what Allende seemed to have latched onto when he originally wrote Jessup his letter. In the 1950s, unified field theory hadn't been proven, but it tried to merge Einstein's general theory of relativity with electromagnetism. And Allende claimed to have been taught by Einstein himself. You can start to smell the kookiness already. And could prove the unified field theory based on events he had witnessed in October 28th, 1943 of the Philadelphia experiment. So Allende said that he saw the Eldridge disappear from the Philadelphia Naval Yard, and he further insisted that the U.S. military had conducted what he called the Philadelphia experiment, and they were trying to cover it up. Well, Jessup was intrigued by this, if not a little suspicious, so he contacted the Navy's Office of Naval Research, who they had received a package containing Jessup's book. Jessup hadn't sent this to them, but they independently received this, with annotations claiming that extraterrestrial technology allowed the U.S. government to make breakthroughs in unified field theory. And this is where it gets really weird. The annotations of Jessup's book, again, Jessup didn't send this, it probably came from Allende. The annotations were designed to look like they were written by 3 different authors. One of them may be extraterrestrial. According to an article in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, Jessup became obsessed with Allende's revelations, and they disturbed researchers. And unfortunately, he became disturbed and he took his own life in 1959. But in 1980, proof of Allende's forgery was made available, finally. And also what's weird is that 2 officers had 127 copies of the annotated text printed and privately distributed by the military contractor, Vero Manufacturing, which gave wings to Allende's theory long after Jessup's death. The Philadelphia experiment theory became, or the conspiracy theory became popularized in 1979 when author Charles Berlitz, who had written a best-selling book on the Bermuda Triangle, and his co-author, the UFOologist William L. Moore, published a book called The Philadelphia Experiment, Project Invisibility, which purported to be a factual account of the 1943 event. And it expanded on these stories, talked about unified field theories, lost theories by Albert Einstein, government cover-ups, all based on the Allende-Allen letters that were written to Jessup. The story was adapted into a 1984 time travel film called The Philadelphia Experiment, and it was only loosely based on these prior accounts, but it further popularized the theory. According to Edward Dudgeon, who served on the U.S. Navy aboard the USS Engstrom, which was dry docked in the Philadelphia Naval Yard at the same time that the Eldridge was, both ships did have classified devices on board. This was World War II, so there was plenty of military research going on at the time. This is during the Manhattan Project, keep in mind. But these devices weren't invisibility cloaks. They weren't teleportation devices designed by aliens. But instead, what they did was scramble the magnetic signatures of ships using degaussing technique, which provided protection for magnetic torpedoes aboard U-boats. The program How Stuff Works suggested that the green glow reported by witnesses that day, it could be explained by an electric storm. It could be explained by St. Elmo's fire, which is a weather phenomenon in which plasma is created in a strong electric field, giving off a bright glow, almost like fire. And also, inland canals connect Norfolk to Philadelphia, which allows a ship to travel between the two in a few hours. Well, the Eldridge was transferred to Greece in 1951 and sold for scrap in the 90s. But the story of the Philadelphia experiment lives on. So as you can see here, the original account, Allende's account, why he claims he saw all these things, maybe he saw some of these things, maybe he was confused by what he interpreted, maybe his memory was faulty, maybe he suffered from mental illness, we're not exactly sure. But as you can see, he described something 13 years after the account. He wrote to another person. This was tenuously connected to a real scientific event where there were technologies being tested out. But this misinformation was interpreted as some sort of secret government technology, and we weren't able to actually look at declassified information until decades after the fact, until this conspiracy theory had already planted roots and become independent of the original event. So This episode will do nothing to dispel the belief in the Philadelphia experiment by the true believers out there, but that's an account for you right there.